Hey guys, so I'm obviously not at school today, but that doesn't mean that we can't get a head start on Unit 2. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Unit 2 is chapters 3 and 4 in your textbook. So chapter 3 is about behavioral genetics and gender, which is what we'll cover today. And chapter 4 is development. We'll do development later on this week. So your notes for today, you should have some guided notes in front of you that look like this. Hold on, let me pull them up. Your guide notes should look like this. There's a front and there's a back. And the notes that we're going to cover today are going to go over all of it. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. So these videos are going to be in 3 parts. So the cool thing about this is that you can stop, start, rewind, fast forward, pause, do whatever you need to do so that you get all of these notes before you leave class today. Okay, let's go ahead and hop into the first video then. So we are doing behavioral genetics and gender today. So what makes you you? And we kind of covered this nature-nurture debate already this semester, just a little bit when talking about behavioral genetics and that perspective. But let's just break it down again. So your nature influences are going to be things like your genes and your heredity, your genetic code that's been instilled in you from your past, like your mother and father, and even generations before then. So all of that are nature influences. Your nurture influences are going to be coming from your environment. So it's the culture you grew up in, the type of parenting styles or style that your parents have, the peers that you hang out with and how they influence you. Everything that influences you coming from your environment are going to be on the nurture side of that debate. So if we put our 7 psychological perspectives in this, this continuum going from nature to nurture, we can kind of organize them based on how much influence they put on nature factors and nurture factors. So let's start off with biological over on the far nature side. Obviously, the biological perspective is looking at your DNA in some cases and how you could be genetically predisposed to act or think in certain ways. So the biological perspective is definitely pretty heavy on the nature side. The biological perspective is also only really looking at an individual's direct genetic past, like your parents or maybe your grandparents and how they've influenced you. While evolutionary perspective is looking more at how are we products of our shared like human evolutionary past, not so much just your mom and dad or your grandparents, but like going back hundreds and thousands of years, how have we maybe through natural selection adapted to our environments, and how has that shaped our genetic code? So that is also on the nature side of the spectrum. Going into cognitive, we're moving a little bit towards the middle here where we're looking at nature and a little bit of nurture. Cognitive psychologists are looking at how you think, problem solve, perceive the world, and a lot of that can be influenced by your genetic past. We know that depression seems to run in families. And that can cause people to perceive the world in a more pessimistic, cynical way. But we also know that, traumatic life events or just life events in general can shape the way that you perceive the world and the way that you problem solve. So it's a little bit of both. Behavioral genetics is obviously going to sit right in the middle here. That's because we are looking at the interplay of nature and nurture. Psychodynamic is going to be a little more on the nurture side because Freud believed that we are products of our childhood and that we have generally traumatic childhoods and that we repress those into our unconscious area. So he's looking at more how are we products of our early years in life. Behavioral perspective is going to be pretty far on the nurture side as well because they're looking at how you learn behaviors from your environment. A true behaviorist would give no mention to any nature influences. They think you are born a blank slate. So they think you learn everything from your environment. So that's obviously pretty far on the nurture side. And finally, sociocultural. Here we're obviously looking at how you're a product of your social setting and your culture. So that's definitely on the nurture side as well. Okay, so let's actually talk about the definition for behavioral genetics. It is the study of the relative power and limits of genetic and environmental influences. We're basically looking at the interplay of nature and nurture. You can look at different traits and try to figure out how much of this trait is influenced by genetic or nature influences and how much is it influenced by our environmental or nurture influences. Okay, so we're going to start off these notes focusing on the nature side of that debate. So just some basic vocab, and you probably already know this from biology classes that you've taken in the past, but just so we can define it here. So our genes are the specific units of DNA that carry our genetic information. Obviously, they're genes. Genes make up our DNA, and that's the genetic code for who we are. And then the DNA makes up our chromosomes, and we have 46 of those in every cell. And they pair off into 23 pairs. And sometimes there can be mutations or problems with these chromosomes that can lead to different disorders. And also, one of those chromosomal pairings determines our gender. And we'll talk about that later on in these notes. All right, so next we have the genome. So the genome is basically the blueprints for any type of, or the genetic blueprints for any type of species. So it's the complete genetic instructions for making any kind of animal, including humans. As humans, we actually share 99.9% of the DNA, but it's that 0.1% that makes us all different. And if you look around the room, you can see that we are all very different. If you think about the world in general, we are all very different people, but we share an overwhelmingly huge percentage of the same DNA. That's part of our genome, the human genome. If you want to take like chimpanzees, we share 95% of the same DNA with them. And you can see there are huge differences in that 5%. So we're close cousins with them, but we are very, very, very different. Okay, so how do we study the interplay of nature and nurture? The most common way to study that is using twins. It's kind of like nature's perfect experiment because we can look at identical twins and then compare them to fraternal twins, and we can see just how much nature can influence a certain trait. So let's just clear up identical and fraternal twins. Identical twins are genetically identical because you start with one fertilized egg and then it splits into two. So any differences between identical twins have to be due to the environment because they are genetically identical. Just a fun fact here. Even though twins are genetically identical, they have different fingerprints. So if you're wondering, how would a court case figure out which twin did it? Well, if they have fingerprints, there you go. That's just a little fun fact there. Identical twins are also not genetic. So sometimes you hear like, oh, twins run in my family. Identical twins, this is a total like fluke in nature. My mom's an identical twin, and I love to joke that she's a freak of nature because this is not something that happens due to some kind of genetic inheritance here. Fraternal twins, this is the genetically inherited type of twin. This is when a woman releases 2 or more eggs at one time, and then 2 or more of those eggs are fertilized at the same time. It's the releasing of the eggs, more than one at one time, that is genetic. So those women just have a higher likelihood of having fraternal twins. Okay, so you have 2 eggs, 2 different eggs that are fertilized at the same time. So those twins are genetically just as similar as any other sibling pairing, except that they're just born at the same time. So differences between fraternal twins can be due to either their genetic differences or to their environment. So what we see when we study twins, identical compared to fraternal, is that identical twins are much more similar in all areas than fraternal twins. This includes like their intelligence level, their predisposition to certain behaviors, even their temperament, which is your emotional reactivity to your environment. This is not the same thing as personality because there are a whole bunch of different things that make up your personality. Your temperament is just one of them, your emotional reactivity, and this continues to be constant from infancy into adulthood. So if you're a fairly anxious baby, there's a good chance that you're going to be a fairly anxious adult. You're just more emotionally reactive than a more mellow baby. You've probably heard of twin studies where identical twins are separated at birth and then they are reunited later in life and they seem to have so many things in common. And studies do show that, yeah, there are some more things in common when it comes to maybe, genetic disorders or, a predisposition to maybe alcoholism and stuff like that, because that can be genetically rooted. But what critics would say is that if you put any two people in a room and you ask them to find similarities between themselves, they're going to find a lot of similarities. So maybe these findings are a little more the product of confirmation bias, where you're trying to validate what you already think to be true, that they should have a lot in common, more than then these studies are actually providing evidence that twins do share a lot later in life. You can decide, it's up to you, it's a current debate. Here's just another way to kind of visualize identical twins versus fraternal twins. Identical twins, because they're genetically identical, it doesn't matter if they're raised in the same or different environments. Differences have to be due to nurture. But we do see that if a child, it doesn't have to be a twin, if a child in general is raised in a different environment apart from their biological parents, they will actually resemble their biological parents in their behaviors and thinking patterns more than they resemble their adoptive parents. With fraternal twins, it doesn't matter if they're raised in the same or different environments. Their differences could be due to either nature or to nurture. Okay, so our next term is heritability. This term often gets confusing for a lot of people, so I'm going to try to break it down as best as I can with this video. We'll probably touch on it again tomorrow when I'm with you guys, just to make sure you get it. So heritability's definition in your textbook is the extent to which genetic individual differences contribute to individual differences in observed behavior. That's a mouthful. I know it's hard to understand. So in other words, heritability is asking how much is this trait influenced by nature rather than by nurture. And the heritability of traits is going to depend on the situation that you're looking at. So here's an example to start us off with. Mark Twain had this really weird thought experiment. You'll see that it's really weird in a second, but it does demonstrate heritability pretty well. So he theorized, what happens if you put 10 unrelated boys in barrels into the age of 12? And they're experiencing the exact same environment. When you give them an IQ test at age 12, obviously the results are going to be lower than most 12-year-old boys because they've been in barrels, but they should be relatively similar because they've all had the exact same environment, the exact same nutrition, the exact same exposure to education. It should be all the same. So their scores should be relatively similar. Therefore, 100% of any differences in their IQ scores would be attributed to their genetic differences. Because remember, these boys are all unrelated. They all have different genetic pasts. So any difference in their IQ scores have to be attributed to their genetic differences rather than their environment, because they've all had the same environment for 12 years. Therefore, the heritability of intelligence in this situation is 100%. That is how much this trait in this situation is influenced by nature. Heritability percentages change as your environmental and your genetic factors interact. So a good rule of thumb is thinking as your environment becomes more similar, heritability increases. Like if you look at the boys in barrels, they had exactly the same environment, thus heritability was really high. It was 100%. But as your environments become more diverse, heritability decreases. So if you took 12 unrelated boys across the United States right now, you wouldn't know really how much of their intelligence differences would be due to nature and due to nurture. So the heritability would be much lower in that situation with those people. Okay, again, I know this is kind of confusing. Heritability is not the same thing as saying intelligence is 100% inheritable. You get 100% genetically. No, we're looking at in this situation, how much is that trait influenced by nature rather than nurture? We'll go over it again tomorrow. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second video.